Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. When I was very young, I was a big fan of Democrat President John F. Kennedy. He was high energy, good looking, funny, and Catholic. I didn't need to know much more. I was too young to know much about politics, policies, platforms, parties. Later on, I thought Jimmy Carter was a breath of fresh air after the whole Watergate / Richard Nixon / Jerry Ford thing. Well, the Carter experience didn't exactly work out too well either. And then someone clued me in on what it meant to be a Democrat or a Republican. It was explained that Democrats wanted to help people by being compassionate, giving them a helping hand, benefits, programs of all kinds. Their idea is that government officials using government resources can be the answer to most, if not all, problems. The trouble is that government has no resources. Everything it gets is from the people. The more you give away to some people, the more you have to take from other people. And then there are the Republicans. I was told that they think that government should serve a very basic role: infrastructure, national defense, foreign policy, those kinds of things. Republicans are supposed to believe that people are basically good, responsible citizens that want to work for what they get. And when they experience a hard time, they need only a temporary helping hand to get back on their feet. Republicans are supposed to believe that the smaller the government, the more freedom we, the people, enjoy, and the more we can decide how our hard-earned money gets used. Smaller government, good. Bigger government, bad. Well, then along came George H.W. Bush, a Republican, and government grew. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and government actually got smaller. Bush II, spending went through the roof. Obama, a Democrat, government grew like a weed. So wait a minute, Republican, Democrat, I'm not seeing a lot of difference here. So personally, I've come to the conclusion that if you're a politician or a government official, you believe in one thing: spending money. And not your money, mind you, the easy kind, other people's money. So what's all this got to do with the big picture today? Well, more and more I'm finding it harder to classify people by political party. And when you talk about issues, I find that it's not all that predictable where people will stand. This is now especially true with larger numbers of union members, blacks and Hispanics, voting for, of all things, a Republican named Donald Trump. Today, on The Big Picture, my guest is a terrific writer and editor for the Buffalo News. Reading his regular column it's a perfect example of what we've just discussed, what I've just talked about. One day, I can't imagine how he ever came up with such a conclusion. And then the next time I read his work, I'm amazed at what a great thinker he is. It's a pleasure to welcome Rod Watson from the Buffalo News to today's Big Picture. Rod, welcome to the Big Picture.
Thanks, Phil. It's a pleasure to be here.
There's, all kinds of examples that we can come up with for columns that I agree with wholeheartedly. I feel as if we're kindred souls.
Okay,
and
I guess we should talk about those then.
And then there's those other columns that I'm thinking that either I'm from another planet or you are, and I'm not quite sure which one. Let's start with that, because I think that might be a more interesting discussion. The border, the current discussion that we have about letting people in or sealing off the border. In one of your recent columns, you talked about how you kind of equate the policies that we're talking about with sealing the border or preventing people from coming in almost as a racist thing. Is that really how you feel, in terms of keeping illegal, from coming into the country?
Given some of the things that this president has said in the past, I don't think you can come to any other conclusion. I think he outright said at one point, why don't we have more immigrants from I don't know if he said Denmark or Sweden or one of the Scandinavian countries. So I don't know how else you read that, except that he wants to keep out, brown-skinned people.
Okay, if you take away his comments and you just go with the policy, should we have open borders, or should we limit and control who comes in and who doesn't come in?
Of course, we should have control over our borders, but I don't think you can separate the policy from the comments, because the comments reflect a mindset that then drives the policy.
Okay, so that being said, what if we have people coming in at the southern border? What would you do if you were in charge? What would you suggest the policy be when people come in large numbers to come into the country?
I think you give them the asylum hearing that they're entitled to, particularly if they're fleeing persecution or gang violence, rapes, murders, those sorts of things. You give them the hearing to see if they have a justified fear of persecution, and then you follow the law.
Up until now, the policy, I think, has been you let them in, you take their name and information, then you release them and expect them to come back for a hearing to see whether they are granted asylum. And in the vast number of cases, they never come back for the hearing. So they're in the country. Should that be changed? Is that a good procedure, or should we just... Right now, the policy is being changed so that we're not allowing people to come into the country and stay here and await some kind of a hearing on their own before we make a judgment as to whether or not they get asylum. In other words, we're kind of controlling it and making the decision and then letting them in, instead of letting them in and then deciding.
I think the old policy was working. I mean, from what I've read, Obama deported more people than any other president in history. So, I mean, the policy was working the way it was outlined in the law. And this president has chosen to ignore that and turn his back on people who are fleeing persecution, gang violence, murders, rapes, like I said. So I don't know how you can consider yourself a compassionate country and yet not make allowances for that.
Well, you do have to, maybe you don't have to acknowledge that there should be a limit as to how many people the country can let in and still remain able to support a population.
Yeah.
So
I don't think there's any disagreement that you have to control your borders. You have to put limits on. Right. It's a question of just following the policy that's in place.
Just, I worked in Los Angeles for 20 years, and one of the stories I did was down on the border in San Diego, and I worked an all-night shift. It was a Friday night, actually, with the Border Patrol at the time, and at the end of the evening, they had captured, I think, 400 people. They had retained 400 people coming in across illegally. And we did an interview with the person who was in charge at the time, and he said it was a very good night. He said, to sum it up, they had captured approximately 10% of what actually came through that night. So in other words, 4,000 people came through. They captured 400. He considered that to be a good night. It kind of put in perspective what they were dealing with, because it was a very difficult night. I followed everybody around, and it was a very tough time for the border agents, and it was a grueling experience. And to think that out of 4,000 people who came across illegally, we only had the capacity to catch 400. His estimate at that time was that there were probably 25 million people that had already come into the country. And this was back in the early 80s. So it's been an ongoing problem. Ronald Reagan addressed it by giving a kind of a semi, if you will, allowance for people to stay in the country, and earn a citizenship, and with the understanding that we would address the problem in the future. But it never really seems to be resolved. I think that's partially because businessmen want that cheap labor to come in. And so if you follow the numbers, if you follow the money, you're always going to come to the, the root causes of problems. And that's, that's neither Republican nor Democrat. That's a greed problem.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I'm doing all the talking here. I just want to.
I think there's one other point you have to look at too. Look at it in the context of what Trump has said and what a lot of his supporters echo about, take our country back. What does that mean? And when you look at brown-skinned people coming in the context of that, I think it makes it clear what is driving a lot of this. And I think that's what a lot of people object to.
Well, it could be that. That's an interpretation. And I like to think that basically what we want to do is, as you said, we want to control the borders and we want to make it sane. How many people we let in. And like many, many years ago, I was considering a job in Canada. And they really, put me through the ringer in terms of my qualifications, who I was, why I wanted the job. And I mean, it was an experience that I couldn't imagine, going through. And that was, our border country. To control our borders and put people through the process that my grandparents had to come through to get into the country. It's not that unreasonable.
I mean, you say take our country back as an interpretation. I don't know how else if you can come up with an alternate interpretation. And when you talk about Canada, I think you have to also recognize the fact that we are the largest, most prosperous nation in the world. I think a responsibility goes along with that in order to help people who are struggling, people who are less fortunate than we are. So I think that responsibility also has to play into it as well. And I think we're ignoring that right now. Well,
and because we are the most prosperous, I think we're the most desirable country in the world to live in. I think people around the world, especially disadvantaged people, they, just like my grandparents did and so many immigrants, they think that this is going to be a better life in living in this country. And unless we can control the border, everybody in the world would want to be here. And we would no longer be sustainable as a country. That's what I interpret take our country back to mean. I don't think in racial terms. And I guess just suspect other people of being the same as me. I never judge someone by the way they look, and to a lesser extent what they say. I judge people on behavior, and that's, I would hope most people would do that.
When what they say jabs with their behavior, then I think that's pretty telling. And I think with this president, the things he has said jabs with his behavior, and I think that leads a lot of people, including me, to that conclusion.
Okay, well, it's an interesting discussion. We're going to talk about our president and some of his policies and whether or not they're good or bad for the country. When we come back, we'll be back for the second segment right after these messages.